Thank you so much. I am so happy to be here and honored to be on the same discussion with Professor DeGiorgi from Italy. I had a chance to read some of his work in preparation, and it was just an honor to be able to listen to you in person. And I have to say that I agree with a lot of the points that he made in his talk about some of the problems with our penal system. And for me, the phrase that stood out for me the most was when he talked about the way that our penal system tries to manage the excesses of complexity in our modern society. I think that it's more than fair to say, as Dr. DeGiorgi has pointed out, that there's a relationship between the economic distribution of wealth and societal punitiveness. It's not an accident that across the globe, the majority of the people who are warehoused in our prisons are the poor and the marginalized. And it's not because they commit the most crimes. It's not because they commit the most harm or cause the most harm to society. It has to do directly with the way in which as how we've organized our society in ways that create levels of inequality and conditions that are suffered by marginalized people. And then rather than dealing with those conditions and dealing with the sources of the inequality, we criminalize people for those conditions and lock them up away from us so that we can avoid looking at the consequences of the ways in which we've chosen both to organize ourselves economically and politically and to distribute whatever wealth is gained. And I would say that it's not an exaggeration to say that the countries that have the greatest level of economic inequality are also the places that are the most punitive in their penal systems. Because one of the many goals that penal law accomplishes is the ability to absolve society of the consequences of lack of housing, lack of education, not providing people with their basic needs. And so rather than redistribute in a way that would help avoid those outcomes, we prefer to scapegoat people for that. And I think that the whole notion of societal scapegoating is integrally related to our penal systems, because throughout the world, regardless of what country you're in, the majority of the people who end up under some form of criminal justice supervision come from the groups of people that are traditional, frequent, and comfortable scapegoats for that particular society, whether they're scapegoated because of their racial identity, because of their ethnic identity, because of their social organization, or their lack of nationality. These are groups of people who politically are convenient scapegoats for elected officials and others who are unwilling to take responsibility for their own choices and have found that they can get and maintain political power by blaming certain groups of people for massive social problems. And we've seen this going on in countries for the last century in a variety of ways, particularly around issues related to immigration and to the use of drugs and to the kinds of crimes that are not inherently crimes, in the sense that when people think about what are the crimes that as a society, we're in general agreement are problematic behaviors, they're things like murder, assault, rape, robbery, direct crimes against individuals and or crimes against groups of people that cause major harm. And yet the crimes that we choose to punish the most are not those crimes. They're the crimes that we've created, what's called malum prohibitum, crimes like using drugs, crimes like selling sex, crimes like being an immigrant, crimes like being unemployed. They're crimes that are really related to status and or poverty, as opposed to crimes that inherently cause harm to society. So I think that's important for us to look at that and what that says, and then contrast it with the things that actually cause major harm that go unpunished. As a person living in the United States, I cannot be unmindful of the fact that we have millions of people locked away for drug-related crimes, for crimes related to poverty, for being mentally ill and living on the streets is a crime that can get you cycled in and out of jail. And yet we don't have a system that punishes the environmental polluters, the ones who are ruining our environment, polluting the air, polluting the water, selling bad food, not just food that's tainted, but food that's basically unhealthy, all of which are activities that are done primarily in the pursuit of profit. We don't have a system that punishes pharmaceutical companies for the highly addictive and dangerous products that they put out into the community and actively market, knowing that they'll cause harm to large numbers of people. We had 93,000 people in the US who died from preventable drug overdoses last year, much of which was originated in the actions of major pharmaceutical companies who chose to market dangerous opiates to people who did not need them. And yet those people escape punishment because they have enough money to be able to manipulate the justice system to avoid not only any kind of physical incarceration or capacitation, but even the loss of their wealth. And that's not something exclusive to the United States. I know when I visited Brazil, there were huge disparities, not just in wealth, but in the ways in which people were punished. Who were the people who were in Brazil's jails? They're primarily poor people. It was amazing to me to walk through favelas that were basically war zones, whole communities that have been turned into war zones under the guise of fighting a war on drugs, so that people cannot walk freely through the streets and engage in everyday activities without worrying about bullets zipping back by them. And we allow for social conditions that don't have children and young people being able to look forward to having reasonable employment, to having their basic needs met. So they turn to the illicit market that will at least provide them enough sustenance to survive. That's a choice that we've made through policy to make it that throughout most of Latin America, there's nothing that you can grow that's going to be more valuable than coca and poppy and marijuana. That's a policy decision. There's nothing inherent about those plants that should make them more valuable than coca, the kind of that you make chocolate from, than coffee, than fruits and vegetables. That's a choice that we've made. And we've had 100 years of imposing policies on countries that only exacerbate the problems. A lot of the violence that we see happening in many countries throughout this hemisphere are directly related to the drug trade and the violence associated with that. If we changed our policies around drug prohibition, we would see a lot of the shift that we saw in the US when we ended alcohol prohibition, which also spurred on organized crime in huge ways that impacted people throughout the country. A lot of that went away when alcohol prohibition ended, but we see it now going on in drug prohibition that's lasted 4 times longer than alcohol prohibition did in the United States. And yet we persist with the policy in spite of its failure. And not only do we persist with it, but we demand that other countries continue the same policies and that any effort at reducing punitiveness is somehow being soft on crime, as opposed to actually taking care of people and treating those kinds of problems the way they should be treated, as a health problem. The problem of the mentally ill who are populating prisons throughout the world is a disgrace, because there's no reason why a person who's suffering from a health condition that's capable of being treated should only be able to find that treatment in a confined setting where all their other actions and freedoms are restricted. And so I welcome the fact that the UN has begun taking really seriously the problem of mass incarceration and urging countries to reverse that trend. And I think that it's important for us in thinking about how we're going about making these reforms away from using incarceration as a tool, that we make a distinction between alternatives to incarceration from alternative forms of incarceration. Because one of the things that modern technology allows is for us to impose many of the same types of restrictions that are imposed on people in current penal settings in other settings. The US here has jumped on the bandwagon in terms of supposed penal reform of requiring all kinds of technological surveillance of people, particularly as an alternative to pretrial detention. And everyone thinks that's a great idea, that people should be able to have an ankle monitor instead of being in jail. But what they've done is transform the jail from the specific correctional facility to the home. So people who are using these forms of technical surveillance have their movements limited in much the same way as if they were behind bars. The monitors will tell if they leave their house, which they're not allowed to do unless they have permission. Even to do things like going to the pharmacy or going to church or picking up their children back and forth from school. And they now, with smartphones, are able to track people's movements in their car. Are they going just from home to work and back every day? And all of that stuff is being, data is being acquired and collected in large databases that are then used to develop algorithms, which are then used to determine whether or not people are risky or whether or not they're deserving of their freedom. And people think that generally that's a good thing without actually thinking about whether or not we're creating a new, more modern technological penal system. In the same way that the building of prisons was considered an advance over the previous way of treating criminals, which primarily relied on torture, that penal systems represented a more humane way of dealing with societal criminals. We could begin to have that same idea about technology if we don't really examine the ways in which we're defining what are alternatives to incarceration. I believe that many of the people who are currently under criminal justice supervision, under some form of incarceration or surveillance, don't need to be in the system at all. Many of the things that they're being charged with are crimes that cause no harm to society. There's very little evidence to say that if you allow to prove that just allowing people to be back in the community and report to court when necessary is any more enhanced by having monitors than not. In fact, some of the studies that have been done here around bail has shown that there's very little statistical difference between people's returning to court and meeting their dates, whether they've had to pay bail or not. So it becomes another way of extracting money from already poor and marginalized people. And the thing I have to add when you talk about technological surveillance is that more and more we're moving to a system where these things are user funded, so that people who've been charged with a crime or convicted with a crime are now paying for the privilege of not being incarcerated, which we used to recognize as a public cost. But in the guise of reform, we're now willing to impose those costs on individuals who are there primarily because they're poor and marginalized. So to me, it's a way of reinforcing and continuing the processes of sustaining and preserving inequality, and preserving and sustaining a method of punishment that targets one group of people over another group of people, that defines crimes in ways that makes it easier to scapegoat those who have the least amount of power to resist. I want to just point out that when we're talking about drug crimes and drug cartels, we rarely ever mention banks, which are an essential component of any major illicit operation. None of them could succeed without having some bank, some method to launder their money. Almost every major bank in the United States has agreed at some point to pay money as recompense for their participation in money laundering, but they're never criminally charged. They're never held absolutely liable, and they never lose their ability to continue to operate as banks in spite of participating in what they know are criminal activities, because our system is not designed to punish people with power and wealth, regardless of what they do. And so I agree with Professor DeGiorgi when he talks about the ways in which we're creating more future threats by the ways in which we punish people today, because we're only reinforcing the levels of stigma, the levels of marginalization, the idea that punishment actually benefits society. We're not doing the kinds of things that we really should be doing to develop a culture of care. There's so much evidence out there that's been accumulated over decades of the importance of actually providing for people's needs, of giving them basic services. The fact that, you know, it's care and service as opposed to punishment and surveillance that's going to help people not just to survive, but thrive. And it's thriving people that will produce the kind of future that is more hopeful than the one that we have today, that has less violence, that has less inequality, that has more people doing things that are productive, that has less people seeking to reduce their pain through the use of addictive drugs, less people looking to involve themselves in criminal organizations engaged in violent activities because they have no family and no hope for the future. We know these things. The question is whether or not we have the will to make the changes that are necessary. The expertise is here. It's represented by all of the people who are here at this conference and many of the people that they work with every day. So it's not that we don't have the capacity to do it. It's not that we don't have the knowledge to do it. The question is, do we have the will? And I do believe that we can have a society that we do not incarcerate people. There are some people who may need to be incapacitated for small periods of time with the idea of helping to restore them back to society, but that does not require the level of dehumanization, marginalization, stigma, torture, and bad treatment that is part of our penal system throughout the world today. So I want to argue for us to begin to really think, as we think about alternatives to incarceration, the real alternative to incarceration is freedom. And for those people who need to be separated for society, we could incapacitate them in ways that's being done in some of the Scandinavian countries that really focus more on treating people as human beings, rehabilitating them, dealing with whatever issue that they have, and then restoring them back to society as productive citizens. And I really thank you for the opportunity to participate in this discussion today.